We're going with this, we're going with the flow. And we're redefining country GDP, national business models and IP flows. That's in half an hour. Mark gave us half an hour for this. I'm a little pessimistic. So we may not have much time for questions at the end, I'm thinking, because we have some slides too.
See how we do.
We'll see how we get on. Very simply, redefining country GDP. Obviously, people will know what GDP is. Consumer spending, government spending, public-private investment, net trade. That is aggregated, and we have a number. It's always been a bit of a blunt instrument. It's not been a very popular indicator to some people, and there have been quibbles about how it's calculated, and obviously refinements along the way. But is it even fit for purpose? We adjust for inflation. Inflation rates in some countries, of course, are pretty notional. And it doesn't include the black economy and things like that. But there's obviously lots more to talk about. So what we're going to do today is we're going to try and define how we value things, anything, and then we're going to move to countries. And to my left, Bill Ribaudo, who managing partner, technology, media, telecommunications at Deloitte and Touche, and also Evan and Mark, who you will all know. And but we're going to start firstly with corporate valuations, right, Bill? So explain to us, with the help of slides, how Wall Street perhaps now is attempting to refine our understandings of valuations at a corporate level.
Sure. So let's start with part of a conversation we had last year here. And maybe I'm just going to back up for a minute and say, Ed, I've been I guess I'll call it a student of corporate value for 21 years. If you went back about 21 years ago, I did a look back that was 10 years further back. And I looked at every single industry sector and its total shareholder returns over the previous decade. And when you graphed it, it was pretty clear that those that were asset-intensive industries versus those that were more intangible asset, that the intangible assets were worth more. That already back then there was a shift that Wall Street was valuing the intangible more than the tangible. Now spin that forward to a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, we completed a 40-year look back on the S&P 500. And we noticed a couple of things. We noticed one is that it's harder and harder to tell what industry a company is in anymore. A simple way to just think about it, something we all can kind of visualize, and we'll talk about mobility later this morning, is you've got a Chevy Volt. I'm pretty sure that's an electric car. You have a Model S. I'm not sure anymore, right? People would say, is that a computer on wheels or is it a car? And let's move to maybe the iCar. And when you look through that, they're the same thing, but wait, maybe there's something different. Maybe one's a car, maybe one's a computer, maybe one is a technological device that becomes an extension of who we are, and you push code through it all the time, right? So you can see that shift even happening there. And what's interesting there is you can't tell what industry those companies are in anymore. And so it then began to tell us that maybe there's a different way we need to view how you would categorize a company, that you can no longer categorize it by the industry, its standard industry classification. So we learned that by that 40-year look back is that there were only 4 kinds of businesses in the world. And it's an easier definition to say that you either make things, provide a service, invent IP, or orchestrate a network. And I think I have a slide that we can show here. Did it pop? I don't see it down here.
Yeah.
Okay. So you see the 1, 2, 4, 8. What we also learned is that Wall Street pays a premium for those business models that use intangible assets, right? So essentially, value has shifted from tangible to intangible, from physical, from tangible to intangible, from physical to virtual. And what you see here is with these 4 kinds of businesses, the 1, 2, 4, 8 is the value of a multiple of revenue that Wall Street pays. So if you make things, you're kind of worth 1 times revenue. If you provide a service, 2. If you invent IP, so you can see biotech, software, pharmaceuticals, 4 times. Or if you orchestrate a network, it's 8 times. And each one of those business models you can actually align with an economic revolution. the industrial revolution, the services revolution, the information revolution, or the network revolution, which I would suggest we've merely just begun. So that's the beginnings of understanding how value has shifted. And in the corporate model, why an investor would pay more for one type of company over another, because intangible assets are worth more, and those businesses scale faster and can produce profits more in the future.
Okay, we're going to hear more about this in a second, but I do want to move us, well, to our other guests, but also to push this wider now and just see how we can deploy these ideas in the slightly bigger context, obviously, of countries. Mark.
So we, about 10 years ago, started looking at the world differently, and I think a lot of the folks here know that. Instead of saying, is it a communist, or is it a socialist, or is it a Semitism, or America, we looked at things just the way that Bill does. So we started asking, what if you looked at every nation in terms of its national business model? Then how would you see the world? And how do countries make money? Just literally, how do they make? Because it turns out that might be a better way of looking at it than some political thing. And that gave us a completely different understanding of the planet and the countries here than we had had before. And we looked back, we started with Japan, because the first thing we realized was in the post-information age, technology drives every single segment of the economy, period. The asset class is IP, intellectual property. So with that lens, we looked back at the business models of the world, and we started seeing that there are people who create IP, and there are countries who create IP, and there are countries who don't, or who steal it, or buy it. And so there's this variety of ways of acquiring, but everybody's got to have it. So you got to grow rice, right? So somehow or other, everyone gets it. The question is, are you stealing it? Are you buying it? Is it being shared somehow? Does the government get it? And if we then looked at the whole planet, we saw a very different planet, and it was almost white and black. If the entire global economy is being driven by IP, who's the gardener? Who's providing the fertilizer? Who's putting the gas in the car? And there is a really, and you'll hear more from Evan about this, but there's a really clear story there. And we started creating names for these models. So the first name we created was the infomerc or infomercantilist, which is hard to say, model. And we looked at Japan post-war, and they had done a brilliant job of implementing the first version of that in our minds. And then South Korea did the same thing. So Japan kind of hit the US, brought about 6 major industries out of the US. Only one of them partially returned, the other didn't at all ever, televisions and so on. And then they made a lot of money. And then South Korea did the same exact thing, kind of like judo, that Japan had done to us, to Japan, using us as the market. The same exact industries. And then China showed up and said, the Mao thing is tiring for us now economically, we want to go somewhere else. And they picked up that exact model, but took it to the moon, refined it, scaled it, really made something. So we saw these things happening, we started writing about them. And Evan created a document which, as you know, the Department of Justice here said it's the best job ever done on understanding how China makes money. So I'm going to defer to Evan on this, but that's the view that we've got.
Right, yeah, so Evan, let's just drill down then a little bit into how you create a valuation model or principle based on these ideas.
Right, and I think actually we might want to turn back to Bill briefly, because I think he has some slides that'll lead us into nation states a little bit.
Sure, yeah, sorry. So Bill, I mean, I should say...
No, that's fine.
That's okay.
Let's do that. Let's bridge kind of the corporate 1, 2, 4, 8 into country GDP, and then take it into exactly what Evan's suggesting. There's a couple of different ways to look at companies and countries, and the way that we're all looking at them is that there are companies in countries, and so you can look at what is the business model of the companies that are in the country that make up the GDP largely, and then as Mark said, what is the actual business model of the country. So I want to look at the business model of the companies in the country that would be making up that GDP. And so put in your mind the 1, 2, 4, 8, and now let's go to the next slide. All right. Whoops. Hopefully I didn't press it twice. All right. Now this one's a little bit hard to see, but let me just orient your eyes to it. What this basically says is that there is correlation to those countries that instill and create more technology creators and network orchestrators than, on a relative basis, asset builders and service providers, right? So if you think about the economic revolutions that occurred in the 1, 2, 4, 8, it says those countries that are more focused on growing the digitally enabled IP-based business models have greater GDP. The top left is US. The red line is GDP. And you can see the two lines going up, I think they're blue. One is technology creator and the other is network orchestrator. There's positive correlation, and you can see on a relative basis, it's relative to each other and relative to the other countries, they're going down. You can see kind of the same thing in China. But when you get down into Germany and Japan, you actually see a positive correlation of the opposite. What you see is an increase in asset builder and service providers and a decrease in GDP. Now, these 4 countries make up 54% of global GDP. So we have yet to extend it to the others, but with 4 countries, you can pick up the majority. If you pick up the 5th, which I think is the UK, you only go from 54% to 56%. So this is beginning to now show the correlation to the company's business models in the country and what it means to GDP. There's one other look that's worth viewing here. This graph here shows that if you look at what are the key parameters that would drive network orchestrators, it's basically mobile internet user penetration, that's the green line, social media network usage, and digital buyer penetration, right? Think about that. So it's digital, social, and mobile. In those countries where it is forecasted to be increased, GDP is also forecasted to be increased, and GDP is the red line. And so you see positive correlation here. But what's interesting is if you look at China, why is it not true in China? So China has actually higher of each of those 3, but relatively lower projection of GDP. And we believe that's a factor of a few things. One is their social controls. And the second one is the overbuilding that's occurred and the need to pull back because of oversupply.
And we would add to that understanding that if IP really does matter, and creation of IP is a source of productivity and GDP growth, if a country is acquiring it without creating it, you're going to see that.
Right. So what's interesting is we actually have approached this differently and gotten to the same part, which is why we've been talking about this now for almost 2 years.
Yeah.
Just a quick point then, because you talk about political control. Obviously, we know that applies in China. Does that affect the valuation of networks operating in China, as you see it, as you would value them? Do you see what I mean? How does that affect?
Yeah, I think how it would affect it is that their ability to flourish would be constrained. And so if you're constraining something that otherwise could grow, then you're going to retard what otherwise could be created, and I guess in this case you could say through GDP.
Okay. Evan.
So what we did to try to measure this innovation was create an index, and there are indexes out there, but we took exception to a couple of the factors at INVNT that were being used. In our world, things like patent application numbers are not very meaningful because there are large-scale national programs to artificially raise the number of patent applications. And if you apply for a patent but you don't receive one, then you haven't really done anything yet. So we took a couple factors like that and R&D spending rather than some other sort of value generation measure out of what we looked at, and instead added some things that I think are kind of innovative. Dr. Richard Florida has actually created an amazing creativity index. Some of those aspects of his index included the patent application numbers, but we removed that and distilled some factors from his work to measure creativity, which is not easy, and none of this is easy. I mean, measuring innovation is difficult, but as everyone was saying, I mean, if it's driving global wealth and where global wealth will emerge in the future, then we want to know, and we want to know an accurate representation that isn't just thrown together factors. So we created our own. We also looked at Nobel laureates, which sounds a little bit strange at first, but once we looked at what factors we could use to truly measure innovation, we were trying to find something that was also not just a leading future indicator, but a measure of past innovation. How do you measure past innovation in the sciences? Well, if someone's been internationally recognized as a Nobel laureate in the sciences, that's a pretty good way of knowing that something really happened there. So we used that as a measure as well and added that in. And what you'll see on the next slide up here is that we took the top 20 economies in the world and scaled them out. And the numbers on the right are color-coded in sets of 5 so that you can kind of see who's most innovative and who's least innovative by the measures that we used. I think this is quite accurate, so we were excited about our results because what we found was this matched what we were already seeing in the world and the patterns that we were already recognizing in the world. And what you find is the countries, Switzerland is a bit of a surprise, but we're also measuring by the population.
Per capita.
So when you use per capita measures, you're truly trying to ascertain the individual productivity of people from that nation. And Switzerland is off the charts. And you also see the other major innovators that you would think of rising to the top, and some others that start to make sense as we move to the next slide. You see national business models emerging. So as we've been discussing, there are a lot of different national business models out there, and we've started to describe a number of them. If you look at the green colored ones on the left here, you're looking at innovators. Those are top innovators. And most of their national business models have shifted at this point or are in the process of shifting to innovation-focused businesses. The kinds of businesses that Bill was talking about with 4x or 8x multipliers. What you see as you move down the spectrum is a couple different other national business models emerging, and many of them are in motion, and we would love in the future to move forward and track trajectory, and I think we will. But if you look at Canada and Australia, so they shift down a little bit, and when you think about it, it actually becomes quite clear why, because they're highly resource-based. They actually stand out in the world as incredibly innovative, developed nations that yet rely a lot on resource extraction as major innovation, or as major, revenue drivers in their economies. So
Do you want to go to that next slide?
Yeah, we can go to the next slide as well. And you start to see when we compare innovation and per capita generation of GDP, these bubbles are representative of kind of groups that start to emerge. So up on the far right, you have economies that are based highly on innovation. And as you move down, for instance, I guess the bubbles are a little bit hard to see on some of these, but that green and red, or the green and blue dot in the middle there would be Spain and Italy. So what's different about Spain and Italy? Well, they're quite innovative, but they're also highly service sector based. So that puts them somewhere in the middle because what they're investing in is not one of the high multipliers that Bill has in his study. So it really correlates well with what Bill's work showed us and what we're learning about national business models. When you start to look at these spreads, you start to see how national business models affect your current wealth, how they affect your per capita generation of wealth. And if we start looking at trajectories, which we certainly will in the future, we're going to start seeing where you're going and how much wealth you will have based on what you're investing in.
I've got to say, not as a proud father, but we throw these little things to Evan now and again, like how does China make money? And we threw this one, Bill and I threw this one to Evan. I think we thought it would take him a few days. It was like, here, just take care of this for us. And he created this whole new Evan index or something we have to name somehow, which I think is now the best index going for how to talk about innovation per nation. It was a lot of work.
And this is a forecasting tool, right? So we are saying now, we think this is as strong as anything else in terms of saying where this country's going to be in 5 or 10 years from now.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Which is, obviously, a couple of crude, rather blindingly obvious points. The oil price might spike in the next 5 years. It might spike easily, or the commodity
but that's
prices.
so old
And
school. Ed.
I understand it's old school, and I call me flat Earth. But look, you've got Canada, you've got Australia, or the Russians, or whoever. I mean, it could be a complete reversal for them and their fortunes, right? And
I think Bill and Evan and I are here to tell you that the things that really matter are the things we're talking about.
Right. In fact, what it begins to raise the issue on is, okay, if we're agreeing values shifted, that it's all about IP and it's the intangibles and all that, that it's can be manifested in business models that companies use and that there's correlation between those digitally enabled business models with corporate country GDP. Then you start to say, well, what's the impact to policymakers and regulators? How should they be thinking about this? And when I have a battle between a physical type of a business and a more digitally enabled type of business. Which is the one should we support? Which is the one that over a longer period of time will create more wealth for the nation? Not sure if that wealth is measured as GDP under today's traditional metric, but let's agree creating more wealth. Some of the work that I showed earlier would say that there is that correlation. So let's just pick one that's fun because we all see it. Let's talk about a physical taxi or coach type of business versus an e-hailing type of business, right? And we know that there's a lot of fighting going on in different cities in the US and in different countries as
Paris,
to which do they meet the regulation, and the policymakers and the regulators need to figure out which ones are they going to back. Well, some of the work that we've talked about would indicate that it's the more network orchestrating models that can create more value would create more value for a country as well over a period of time.
This is a disaster for emerging economies, though, generally, isn't it? I mean, this is off the bat, but apart from maybe Israel, South Korea, other than Europe and the States, there aren't that many digital economies in the world at the moment.
Doesn't it just give them a new path? I mean, if you were an emerging nation, I'll give you a really good example, but if you were an emerging nation, and in the old days, I think the textbooks say, here's how you're going to do it. You start out with a resource or ag economy or resource. You move from that into other people's manufacturing. You try to go up the food chain. 5 generations later, you're somewhere else. We're lucky to have with us Emmanuel Way, who is a very brave man, who is running for president of the Republic of Congo. And he'll tell you all about it while we're here. But one of his main ideas, I think, is that he wants to bring IT to the Congo. So he's doing exactly what Bill's talking about.
I would actually say the opposite. Yeah, I think that this is actually a miracle for emerging nations because there has been a long history of, the International Development Project and neoliberal policies that attempted to build economies from scratch that weren't organic and weren't seated in the local culture and the local business environment, and they didn't work very well. And so if you were an emerging nation 25 years ago, you were looking at an international landscape that seemed pretty static. And it was really hard going building an economy. This, I think, is a huge amount of hope and a huge amount of promise exists here for emerging nations and we see it anecdotally in the world. We see countries jumping. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa is moving fast these days. And part of it is that you can sit down with someone who may have, a long history of little education and little disposable income in their families. And if you can get them access to technology, they can be coding in the same language as someone who just went through 10 years of schooling in a developed nation at the same level, which I know, drives coders insane because their job competition is a dangerous world out there if you're a coder. So it provides actually a leapfrogging technique, I think, for emerging nations that has a huge amount of promise.
How does this key into the whole issue of IP and IP theft and everything else? Mark?
Funny you should ask that.
I thought you'd like to answer it.
Well, we do have a whole panel, and Evan's going to return to the stage and address that directly. So I don't want to steal thunder here, but what would you like to say right now?
We'll cover it more in a later session, but I think that the results of IP theft in this context become obvious. It's important to have that intellectual property if you'd like to build wealth in the future, and if you'd like to build wealth at 8 times the rate of, for instance, an agrarian economy. So if you're losing your IP, you're losing that promised future wealth that you've worked so hard to achieve. You're losing that growth rate, and therefore you're losing your leg up and your advantage in the international economy.
Right.
So there could be nothing more important than protecting something that gives you a 4 to 8 times multiplier on essentially your success rate. I think it's just incredibly reinforcing for those of us that work in the intellectual property protection world to see something that so clearly displays the importance of that subject.
We could just take one quick question if someone wants to stand up and go to a mic. But
Ted, we've entered a time that I think everyone has been unprepared for. So given the truism of IP drives, or the technology drives every piece of the economy, none of us in the world were ready for the idea of nations the size of those in Asia or China to adopt a model based on theft of IP. We didn't have the technology protection in place. We didn't have the policies in place. We didn't have anything. And we lost petabytes by a day of this stuff. And so now that what Bill's describing, I think we see the initial results after 20 years of this or so, 15 years. And Evan's perfectly right about this. We didn't learn to protect, so now we have to learn. The people who make IP have to be much, much better at protecting it. It is what their shareholders are investing in, as Bill's pointed out. And the people who steal it have to face that Bill's chart, because they have to recognize that by not inventing their own stuff, by not putting the money into their own research, but just calling it research and stealing instead, they pay the piper at the middle and end of that program, where they start losing the competitive battle instead of winning.
Quick question.
Right, I'm Thomas Curran. Two things I wanted to ask you, if you look at, or if we've clocked as a general topic. I mean, in 2009, as CTO of the Telecom in Germany, I was invited to this strange office nearby the Prime Minister's, and with 5 other people, and asked to institute something in Germany that's a national program for IoT called Industry 4.0. It's not only a program, it's a program of intellectual property protection, standardization, and it's designed from the outset, and that was the goal, to protect and defend the German position in innovation and blah, blah. Is that something, and not surprisingly, I could say, after leaving Deutsche Telekom, the Japanese government asked me to talk to them about the same thing. Is this something that you see having a bigger impact on some of these correlations than we have seen in the past? That's one. Industry 4.0 is now very popular in Germany. I don't know if it's really leading to a lot of innovation. The second thing, which again comes from my network management days, is that you have now complete third world or developing nation economies in a network sense that are built from countries and companies. I'll just give you Huawei as an example. The reason is it not only has to do with homogeneous networking infrastructures, including mobile and fixed net, it also has to do with them providing their, for us at least, closed IP stack.
I'm sorry, we have to stop because we are going to run out of time very shortly.
Those are just two things I want to make sure we're clocking as important infrastructural trends.
Okay, so I mean, very simply, national business models are nations. Do nations truly understand the concept of having a business model? I suppose that's the question, isn't it? Do nations have the business models? Is that a realistic system? If you're not talking about China, I mean, a normal country.
I guess it depends on whether we're talking about, again, the company's business models in the country or the actual country's business model. And
Yeah.
in the case of how Mark has described it, it is what is the model that the country is using to make money, and then the companies kind of fit within that. I'm not sure how to answer the question because I didn't hear the rest of it. But to the extent that countries are working on protecting their IP, I mean, I guess we would say that that's good, right? I mean, that's
Sure. And they're just starting. They're not doing very
Yeah,
well.
I think that they're only just realizing this, and the ones that are ahead of the game have understood this for a while, and the rest are catching up.
Great, we're going to call it quits there because we're already into overtime. But thank you very much.
all right. Great.